Okay, so real quick, some of the general characteristics of quail. And some of you that are familiar with them, know this stuff. But just to review for those that might not be as familiar, talking about northern bobwhite, also known as bobwhite quail or just simply quail. This is a small resident gallinaceous bird, so it's in the turkey, grouse, quail, pheasant family that requires grassland or shrubland habitats. And a previous version of this talk, I mentioned that they prefer grassland or shrubland, but they actually require it. And that's a key difference between quail and some other species, is they're very dependent on this type of habitat that we'll be talking about over and over again, I'm sure, throughout the course of the morning. So I want to do that for emphasis there. They forage primarily on seeds, leaves, and insects. They eat a variety of things. They're social birds that form coveys. And for the quail hunters in the room, I'm sure you know that covey rise is something that is just sort of unmatched in the hunting world. That really is exciting when that group of birds explodes at your feet, and that's what many of you can remember. It's a short-lived species with a high reproductive potential. So this becomes important when we talk about some of the they can really decline quickly, but they can also improve their populations really quickly. So something that most people don't realize is an 80% mortality rate is actually fairly common with quail. So about 8 out of 10 birds are going to die each year, and that's perfectly normal, but they can really produce a lot of young and improve that population quickly as well. So, okay, in Maryland, and really throughout the range of quail, quail were essentially a function of the landscape and land use over the past several thousand years. Prior to European settlement, there was probably lightning strikes, and Native Americans were burning vast amounts of the landscape, probably created some really good quail habitat, and there were a lot of reports of an abundance of quail when settlers arrived. And that continued through the time of settlement, and as land was cleared, small-scale agriculture, and timber clearing probably produced a landscape that was very suitable for quail, and their population thrived. So there's a lot of reports through the early 1900s of quail being very abundant. They were a popular game bird for many years, and even as recently as 1975, we had 50,000 quail hunters in Maryland. To put that in perspective, that's about how many deer hunters we have now. So this was a very popular species with a lot of hunting activity associated with it. And this is the sad part of the talk. Unfortunately, this is the breeding bird survey data for bobwhites in Maryland. They've declined precipitously at around 10% per year. This is the bird that has declined more than any other bird species in Maryland since this survey began in 1966. So we can look at some other data coming from the birding community. This is the eBird, which is if you're not familiar with it, it's a website where birders can report where they see quail, and we can kind of get an idea of where quail are on the landscape. And it looks like, that is working. But you can see on the eastern shore here, we still have I wouldn't say a robust population, but this is the stronghold in Maryland. If you have land on the eastern shore, you're probably not further than about 5 or 10 miles from an existing population of quail, which is good news because they disperse at certain times of year. So these dispersing birds can find new habitats and can colonize any habitat that you create. It's a little different story on the western shore. Things are pretty bad over there. Haven't had any sizable populations there for probably 20 years. The exception might be southern Maryland, where there are a few pockets where they still are hanging on there. I just want to point out that these are range-wide declines that we're facing with quail, so all the states are in the same boat. If it's red on this map, they are declining at a significant rate, and there's really very few parts of the country where they where quail are doing well. The only exception is Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska area. Okay, so the $1,000,000 question: why did quail decline? When you've been doing this job for 20 years, you've heard it all, and there's a lot of discussion about what it is, and everybody's searching for that key factor. And quail are the most studied game bird in North America. So there is literally hundreds of folks looking at these issues for decades about why quail are declining. And if there was a single factor, a smoking gun, so to speak, that one thing that you could change to get quail back, we would have found it by now. Unfortunately, it's a really complicated issue, and there's a lot of factors at play that have caused the quail decline. And based on the current research and what we know, I kind of group things into some overarching categories. One would be direct habitat loss factors. So you've got things that a lot of people. Fields are larger, less brushy hedges, and also development. Just that's really easy to understand. When you pave over an area, that is no longer habitat. So this is very easy to understand direct forms of habitat loss. Something that kind of creeps up on you is that last one on that list, maturing forests, which kind of is cut off there. Can we minimize that maybe? There we go. So maturing forest is something that we don't, it's not an instantaneous change. We've seen our forests get older through time. There's less timber harvest, there's less sunlight reaching the forest floor in a lot of our forested systems, and that means less habitat, less places for quail to hide, less food for the birds. So that's something that takes place over time, but it's actually a major factor causing the decline of these birds. We also have changes in agricultural practices. There's, with increased technology, there's less food and cover after harvest. Increased use of herbicides means fewer weeds for these birds to eat, or fewer insects, fewer weeds. It all plays into decline in habitat quality. It's also a lot of non-native grasses instead of native grasses. And all of these factors can kind of be grouped together into habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation, which again isn't something that you think of necessarily, but if you've got 10,000 acres of habitat that you maybe would have had 4 or 5 decades ago, and everything's working well, and these birds are moving around the landscape, the population's thriving, and then a section of that maybe is turned into a much larger field. You lose that connectivity, and the habitat becomes fragmented. That population cannot function as it once did, and you'll see those populations decline. And with this habitat issues, we see low survival and low reproduction. And as I said, a lot of these birds are going to die. Even in the best habitat, you're going to have 70 to 80% dying every year. So you have to replace the birds that you've lost, or your population ends up declining. So I know some of you are thinking you're missing a key thing on this graph, and I'm going to include it on here, okay? Because we do understand that predator populations have increased significantly in the last several decades. And I'm not going to lie, they definitely have an impact on quail populations. I don't think any biologists disagree with that. And it's just one of those things that has exacerbated an already a problem that's already existed. But these predators can find birds in this limited habitat and have more of an impact. So while we're on predators, just take a minute, and everything wants to eat a quail. I mean, either quail or quail eggs, quail chicks, everything's out to get them. They've got a difficult life. So there's an abundance of mammalian and avian predators out there. Kind of just sum it up by saying that based on the science that we have now, predator communities are really complex. They're dynamic. As one thing increases, another one decreases. You've got a lot of moving parts. You've got buffer species where predators might be feeding on something else. So when their population is high, that eases the pressure on quail themselves. All that's intermixed with habitat issues. And if you've got good habitat, you can protect these birds from predation. So when you set out to saying we're going to control predators or manage predators, it's not an easy thing. It's not as easy as just throwing a few traps out there and, you know, eliminating the predators that you have. Trapping has really rarely resulted in any documented population increases. And that's been shown time and time again. To do it on the scale and the intensity that's needed is almost beyond what most of us can do with the limited size of our properties and the manpower we have. So what's left? We have to focus on habitat, and that's what the rest of the talk will be.
I didn't see the slide. I didn't see like feral cats or house cats there. Is that a factor?
Yeah, I've got a cat there on the bottom right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one of them. And there's
how big is that problem?
And there's other ones. It's hard to say, but it's definitely not helping the situation. So sometimes it's easier when we're thinking about what quail habitat is to look at what quail habitat is not, because there's a lot more things that aren't quail habitat. Closed canopy forest. So this is what I was describing with the, when there's no sunlight hitting the forest floor, there's no quail habitat. They will not use it. When they try to go through this, they're going to get whacked by a predator. It's just as simple as that. They can't survive in this type of forest. Modern agricultural fields, mowed areas, overgrazed pastures, parking lots, roads. It's a lot of stuff. Drive around and see how much of this is out there. And you're probably thinking, well, what's left? Like, is there anything else? And that's the reason we're in the situation we are. Okay. Quail habitat is everything else. It's early successional shrubland or grassland habitats with a diversity of grasses, forbs, shrubs, or small trees and food sources. That's kind of a messy definition because quail habitat's messy. It's a lot of different things going on there, but each of those components is important from a quail life needs standpoint. So it's just some examples of some places that have quail. And you can see you can do it in an agricultural situation with some field borders and like that, or in forested situations. But either way, you need that diversity of grasses and forbs. And I mentioned early successional habitat, and that's going to be a theme throughout today. Essentially, if you're not familiar with that term, think about it as if you fallowed a crop field. So you just stop farming a field. What's going to happen? The first year you're going to get those annual weeds and grasses, things like foxtail, ragweed. It's going to transition into more perennial grasses and forbs. A lot of your native grasses start coming in year 2, year 3. Now it's going to move into more of a shrub or small tree dominated area, blackberry and things like that. And that's really your early successional habitat. Beyond that, you're getting into a forested system that is not quail habitat. So I want to take a minute to recognize that we're not just talking about quail, okay? So there's a whole suite of species that need this similar type of habitat. And songbirds, there's a good dozen songbirds that are in steep decline as well. Pollinators are a big issue recently, and they depend on the same type of habitat. And even things like turkeys, you might think turkeys are doing well. They're doing better in places where they've got this type of habitat. If you think about it, a turkey poult, when it's small, is the same size as a quail, same predators, they need the same food resources. So if you put in good quail habitat, you're going to see more turkeys. So some of the most declining bird species in Maryland, just to kind of drive that point home, this is from the Breeding Bird Survey again. And what really sticks out is the vast majority of them depend on grassland or early successional habitat. Okay, some real quick quail habitat basics. This is just, doesn't have to be exactly like this, but you need a component of grasses, forbs, and shrubs as part of that habitat. 40%, 20, or 33, 33, 33, whatever, but you want these components in that habitat. What do they use grasses for? These native, and I'm really talking about native grasses. These aren't introduced exotic grasses like fescue and orchard grass. These are your native grasses, broom sedge, little blue stem, things like that. They primarily use them for nesting. You can Promote this type of habitat through native grass plantings or even fallowing fields, depending on your seed bank. That forb component of their habitat provides a lot of food. Grass seed doesn't provide much food, but forbs do provide the various seeds, green vegetation, produces insects. It's great for brood habitat, which often is a limiting factor on many properties. So you can incorporate these types of things into your planting mixes. Again, fallow fields. Burning is a great way to promote forb production. And lastly, and this is probably perhaps the most important in this part of the country, as we get into the northern latitudes, this escape or winter cover becomes very important. So the shrub component of the habitat is important. When you get a foot or two of snow on a property, they need a place to go to hide from predators. So these clumps of shrubs are very valuable from a quail's perspective, and they need to be relatively close around, scattered around the landscape, but not too far apart so that they can, access them easily. Okay, and with any of this habitat, we need to keep in mind that it requires some maintenance or management. This early successional habitat won't remain early successional for long. It's going to want to transition into late successional habitat. So you need some sort of management. You need either disking, prescribed fire, which is probably the best way to manage quail habitat, or some sort of timber harvest, some sort of way to get it back into that early successional state. So what can you do? Hey, you're all here, so you're all obviously excited about trying to do something to help the cause, but spread the word about the decline of quail and other grassland birds. Like I said, understand they need disturbance. You can't just rope it off and just let the stuff grow up and say, we haven't done anything, so we're protecting the quail. It doesn't work that way with a species like quail. We have to do something to maintain them. Support conservation organizations, prioritize habitat. Quail Forever has become real active in Maryland, and that's a great organization. And assuming most of you are landowners here, do what you can. Every little bit helps. And the more we can piece these things together, we've got a better chance to stabilize the declines and increase their population. And lastly, it doesn't work there, and I think you'll hear some other success stories today, hopefully. But there is hope. Habitat does work. We've got numerous examples of stable or increasing populations where we've established proper habitat. It's just one example of our WMA down in Wycomico County. We did a bunch of grass and forward plantings, timber harvest, followed that with a bunch of prescribed burning. And this is the number of quail per acre through time. Had no quail there for about 5 or 10 years, and that population's taken off. There's birds whistling down there. Maybe not today with the rain, but on a nice sunny day, there's birds whistling there all the time. And don't know if we've got time for questions since we're running a little behind. One question. Go ahead.
Along perimeters where you have forbs turning into trees, and you have a tremendous amount of Russian olive, which is kind of basically every place. If you cut that off and just kind of push it in, does that provide habitat right along the perimeters for the winter?
Yeah, so there'll be some benefits to, like, you essentially talk about like brush piles or yeah, definitely some benefit the first year or two probably where it can be used as a escape cover, but it doesn't take too long until they start to decompose. Yeah,